Please pray with me. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for this community, this gathering of people, this opportunity to lift praise to you. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing to you and fall upon hearts that are open and accepting to your word. Amen. So our first lesson today, which is where Elijah calls fire down from heaven, reminds me of one of the first times that Keith and I went camping after we had moved here to Rockford some 30 plus years ago. And it was a particularly wet summer that year, not entirely unlike what we've had up until recently. And we were at White Pines State Park, where everything was damp, especially the firewood. It was supper time, and Keith and I were sitting next to this pathetic excuse for a fire that we had built. It was much more smoke than it was heat or light, believe me. There wasn't even enough heat to roast a marshmallow. It was that bad. Some of you campers who have camped in the rain know exactly what that's like. Anyway, we were watching this man in the, with great envy in the campsite that was next to us as he built his fire. He took rocks and he carefully placed them around the fire pit. And then he took little pieces of wood and larger pieces of wood and then little logs that he carefully erected into this beautiful structure. This wood, all of which, mind you, he had pulled out of the back of his pickup truck. And even from a distance, we could tell that this wood was seasoned and ready to burn. Anyway, he laid this fire so carefully that it was a work of art when he was done. I was waiting for the photographer from Campers Weekly to wander by, you know. We were embarrassed sitting next to this smoldering little mess that we had tried to create. But he didn't light it right away. He strutted around his campfire, very clearly proud of what he's done, proud of all the attention that this beautiful, beautiful fire had drawn. But he didn't light it yet. It wasn't until dark that we saw him go back over to his fire pit ready to light it. And he had a can with him. And he poured the contents of the can on that fire. And it was about the time I said to Keith, "What do you suppose that is?" that he struck the match. And he touched it to that wood. And there was this enormous whoosh. And a fireball flew up into the air. And all of that very carefully laid wood blew out of that fire ring 10 feet in every direction. Burned some holes in the guy's tent. It was very, very impressive. And I kind of wonder if maybe that's what it was like for Elijah and all those people gathered on Mount Carmel that day when fire fell down from the sky and Elijah confronted the worshipers of Baal, except without the benefit of matches or gasoline. Some of you maybe are already familiar with this story of Elijah calling fire down from heaven. But I find it helpful when you're reading, particularly in the Old Testament, when you're reading to get a little bit of context. So I'm going to start today's reflection with just a little bit of background for us. So first, the who's who. We've got Elijah. Elijah's this great prophet of God in the northern kingdom of Israel, and that's about all we know about him. Not a whole lot of background that we find in the Bible about him. But we do know that he's on fire for God, and that his name means, "My God is Yahweh." My God is the Lord. So that alone tells us an awful lot about Elijah and what his priorities are. We have Ahab. Ahab is the 7th Jewish king of the northern kingdom. So he's an Israelite, he's a Jew. Ahab's father sought to secure his homeland by marrying his son Ahab to the daughter of a king of another land. Very typical thing that you did then to consolidate your kingdoms, to enhance the security, to build those ties. So Ahab's father married Ahab to the princess Jezebel, who was the daughter of the king of Sidon in Phoenicia. Jezebel also happened to be a priestess of the pagan god Baal. So Baal, another character in our story, Baal was the Canaanite god who was believed to be responsible for rain, thunder, lightning, and dew. Baal worshippers were allowed to practice very earthy, amoral, loose kind of lives. And since we're keeping this G-rated today here, I'm just going to let your imaginations go to figure out what an amoral, loose, and earthy life might look like. So story background then, Jezebel, Ahab's new wife, comes to the kingdom, and she brings with her this large entourage of priests and prophets for Baal into this country after they're married. Ahab, who's considered to be kind of a weak king, bowed to the pressure from his new wife to build a temple to her god, Baal. This, of course, violates everything about the Israeli covenant with God, to have no other gods before him. So here's the king of Israel, northern part of Israel, instead of being a champion for God, allowing instead to have the worship of a pagan god commonplace in his kingdom. So enter the prophet Elijah, who warns King Ahab that God is going to send several years of catastrophic drought to the kingdom because the Ahab and the Israelites have done disfavor in God's eyes. They've done evil in God's sight. This drought is going to be so severe that not even dew will fall to the ground. Now, when I was raising my kids, I was a big believer in natural consequences of your choices. And it seems to me that when you throw over the one true God for the pagan god of rain and dew, that a drought occurring is a pretty natural consequence of that. Am I right? So in fact, true to Elijah's prophecy, a 3-year drought had occurred in the land. And this drought was so severe that most of the rivers and streams had dried up, the grass had withered away, there was very little food for the animals, and the people were starving. Ahab blamed Elijah for this drought, and he put a contract out on Elijah's head. These two guys basically were arch enemies. And that's where our story begins today in 1 Kings. Elijah is called by God to go to Ahab, confront him, and confront the people who had fallen away, and to show that God is the one true God. So Elijah goes to Mount Carmel. Ahab calls the kingdom together. All of his court comes. The Israelites come. All of the Baal priests and prophets come. They've all gathered on Mount Carmel. And Elijah turns to the Israelites and he says, "How long are you going to waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him." So most of the Israelites at this time weren't going to spend a whole lot of time speculating about other gods besides Yahweh. There were much more important questions in their life, like where am I going to get food and water? But the question of where water comes from, who controls the rain, who controls the cycles of life and death, these were questions that were beginning to impinge on the Israelites because they're living in this split culture. Here they are, bound by their covenant to honor and worship and live according to the laws of the one true God, Yahweh, yet tempted by the materialistic, self-centered, free life that came from serving gods like Baal. Doesn't really sound all that much different than what we face today, really. As Christians, we live in a split culture, right? Here we are bound by a covenant to live a godly life led by Jesus Christ, yet constantly tempted by the material, self-centered, free life that comes from serving false gods like money, prestige, power, fashion, and the like. In our Romans lesson, Paul calls this living according to the flesh and having our minds set on what the flesh desires. The more things change, the more things stay the same, right? So the Israelites are challenged by Elijah to choose their path. Is it going to be the way of the Spirit or the way of the flesh? He asks, why don't you people make up your minds? If the Lord's God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. Make up your minds. This question is pertinent, it's honest, it's urgent. And despite the gravity of this question, the Israelites answer with an overwhelming silence. So Elijah lets God help them make up their minds. He says, look, There's 450 priests of Baal here, and there's just me for God, for the Lord. Let's have a little contest. You guys lay some wood, put on a bowl. I'll do the same. We'll both pray to our gods to call fire down, and whichever one sends fire is the real deal. So that's exactly what they do. The priests of Baal lay their altar. They call to their god for fire from morning till noon. Nothing happens. So in true spectator sport fashion, Elijah starts to taunt them. So they redouble their efforts, and they cry to their God, and they cut themselves, and they gnash their teeth, all to no avail. And finally they give up. So it becomes Elijah's turn. So as we read then, Elijah took 12 stones, and he used these stones to build up the altar that had been torn down by the unbelievers, the altar to the Lord. Now, 12 stones, this is really significant. The 12 stones represent one for each tribe of Israel. By doing this, Elijah is reminding the Israelites, who can't seem to make up their minds whether to worship God or Baal or to try to walk some line down the middle by worshiping both. He's trying to remind them about their covenant with God. It's a powerful reminder of their heritage, these 12 stones. So Elijah fixes up the altar of the Lord, which has been torn down previously. He puts wood on top of it. He cuts up the bull. He lays it on top of the wood. He digs a big trench all the way around the altar. Then he turns to the people and he tells them to dump 4 barrels of water over the altar. Now, we're talking barrels here. Not little buckets, but barrels of water. And he tells them to do this 3 times. And if you're doing the math, 3 times 4 barrels is 12 barrels of water. So again, we see that number 12. A powerful reminder to those Israelites that the God of Abraham is the God of the 12 tribes of Israel. He is the God of the chosen people. He is their God. So the meat and the wood are soaked. The trench is filled with water when they're all through. Now, remember, they've been suffering this 3-year drought. Can you imagine the value of those 12 barrels of water? We're talking hundreds of gallons of water. 200, 300 gallons. This isn't just a little sprinkle that he's put on the altar. This is a cascade of water. Water beyond abundance. Did those 450 priests of Baal gasp at the excess? Probably. 1 4-barrel drenching probably would have been sufficient to wet everything down. 2-barrel drenching would have been extravagant, but 3 times Elijah has them pour water. And he doesn't even flinch when they pour enough water over this altar that it could give life to the plants and the animals all around. Because Elijah knew that the source of the water of life was in his corner. And he wanted to demonstrate that our God is a God of exuberant abundance and of plenty and of life. Something else about this water dumping that's interesting. Up until that point, Elijah had done all the work. He'd laid the stones. He'd cut the wood. He cut up the bull. He dug the trench. But when it comes to the water pouring, he turns to the people and he says, go get the water and pour it on. Why? I think it's so that they're no longer just spectators. By moving them into action, Elijah is engaging them. And by engaging them, he starts them on the path toward making a commitment, making a choice for God and not for Baal. Evening comes. Elijah boldly invokes God, and he says, let everyone know today that you are the God of Israel and that I am your servant. And the fire from God falls down from heaven, and it eats up the bull and the stones and the water in the trench, even the dirt. Imagine a mighty whoosh and a fireball. God answers, and he answers big. He shows that he is indeed the Lord of creation by bringing down fire to consume everything. This fire burns with ferocity beyond anything of normal physics. God has indeed answered. And the people fall down to their knees and they say, "The Lord is God, the Lord is God." Baal is defeated, and Elijah then prays to God, and rain starts to fall on the land, quenching the thirst of the land and in the land. So the people chose, and they chose the God of Israel. Note something here. Elijah himself did not try to convert the people to the belief in Israel's God. But he did bring them to the point where they were ready to decide. How? By acting boldly as God's vehicle. He let God act through him. He let God speak through him. He knew that for people to make no choice meant that they would choose Baal, because not choosing God is to choose against him. The people said nothing when Elijah first challenged them about their divided loyalties, but by the end of our story, they had come to the point where they were willing to decide by witnessing the work of God and by opening themselves up to his answer. Paul, in our Romans lesson today, spells out pretty clearly this same message of choice that faced the Israelites in our Elijah lesson, the Romans in Paul's time, and really us today. He says in verses 5 and 6, remember, those who live according to the flesh have their minds set on what the flesh desires, but those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. These verses raise the most basic questions in life that we face. Who is in charge? Who's calling the shots? What's your mindset? What is important to you? Like the Israelites, these Romans that Paul addresses, and we, really, today, have to choose. We have to turn from worshiping the false gods of the material and the temporary, the flesh, as Paul calls it, and instead embrace the life-giving power of God. And it is a choice that we face every day. The willingness to choose to base a decision for God is a move toward faith because it shows an openness to allow God to work. Like Elijah did as he engaged and encouraged the Israelites to make their choice, we as the people of God have no greater task than to first choose for ourselves and then move others toward a willingness to choose. Still, though, when we're asked to witness to God's power, we often hesitate because we don't think we have the words to convince somebody of God. When that happens to you, keep Elijah in mind. When you are called to witness, you don't need to do the convincing. You're just asked to demonstrate what God has done in your life. And God will work through you, and he will work through your words, and he will work through your work. We can witness to how the power of God can change us, how it can renew and refresh us. And then we can engage people to choose for themselves, to let God work at transforming their lives. The life of a prophet, someone who is on fire for God, is active and it's vibrant and it can be exhausting and it takes grit and determination and courage sometimes. This summer we've been visiting the Spirit Garage, considering the theme Forged for Mission, Sent into the World. Forged, tested, hardened by fire. How have we been forged? Well, we've been forged by the experiences of our lives, the good and the bad, the happy and the sad, the easy and the hard. We've been forged by the relationships that we've entered, and the people we've known, and the people we've been shaped by. We're forged by the choices that we make, wise and foolish, good and bad, and by the natural consequences of those choices that we make. What does it look like to be forged for mission and sent into the world? Well, first, you gotta choose God. Then you gotta have a little courage, and you gotta have a little faith, and you gotta know your purpose. Your purpose. For Elijah, he knew his purpose. He knew he didn't do it for himself, and neither do we. Elijah did it to show God's glory to everyone else. He didn't need convincing of God's power. He didn't flinch. He didn't doubt. In fact, he poured it on, literally. And he did it with perfect calm. No fumbling with the matches. Now, such supernatural demonstrations of God's power, like fire being called down from heaven, or a burning bush, or walking on water, they're not seen so clearly today, at least not by most of us. However, that same power of God's Spirit works through us, and it works in us. In our baptisms, we were drenched in life-giving water. Paul says in our Romans lesson, those who live in accordance with the Scripture have their minds set on what the Spirit, those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. And when we open our hearts to the Spirit, his fire fills us with that strength and that courage and that wisdom. When we act for God, when we act for good in his name, we are prophets, witnessing to God's vision for the world. So what does being on fire with the Spirit look like in your life? Do you ever trust God so much that you pour it on, that you almost dare God to make a show in your life for others to see his glory? Ask yourself, what does being on fire with the Spirit look like in my life? God has forged us for mission. We are being sent into the world, quenched by the water of life, while aflame with the Spirit of God. Amen.